like to welcome you all to this first keynote controversy at the Battle of Ideas 2012. The question, what's wrong with equality, almost seems to be overly provocative. There are, however, some confusions that have emerged about what equality means, it seems to me, today, which is why we wanted to discuss this. President Obama in the US has called inequality the defining issue of our time. And you could say, what's wrong with that? But I think that we don't necessarily know what we mean by that. And sometimes people will say we have to make the gap between rich and poor, for example, narrowed. But they don't necessarily answer the question, well, say if all the poor people got richer and the gap grew bigger, is that a bad thing? Do we all have to be the same? We don't seem to be sure anymore. We're not sure if equality is now more associated with economic fairness, if that's what we're aiming for, or we're also not sure whether, because it's become commonplace, equality is associated with equal rights in the kind of traditional political sense. Every minority, it's argued, needs to be protected against the abuses of the majority. And it's often seen that the majority, if they're let be free, will simply deny equality to the minority. But does that mean that we have more equality for minorities and less freedom for majorities? These are some of the kind of issues that we are going to consider, at least. Now I'm going to introduce the panel in the order in which they'll speak. First of all, we've got Thomas Hyland Eriksen, who is considered to be one of Norway's top public intellectuals, and indeed he is. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Oslo. He's the author of far too many books to mention in English and Norwegian. He's also a novelist. He's currently directing a number of research projects, one on the politics and poetics of place, another on the comparative project on three crises of globalization. Next up, Trevor Phillips, until recently chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission and has been since 2006. He's the author of The Best Intentions, Race Equality and Delivering Today's NHS, and the Equalities Review, an independent review commissioned by the then Prime Minister. The main thing, the reason he's near is not because he's got a kind of title with the word equality in it. It's because, as people will know, Trevor is outspoken, thoughtful, and doesn't take orthodoxies at face value, which is why we wanted him here. Next up is Sue Christoforou. I hope I've said that right. I'm sorry. Who is the Policy and Research Manager at the Equalities Trust project, One Society, that campaigns to redress income inequality in the UK. And the Equalities Trust was set up by the authors of The Spirit Level, that has made a very big impact on this debate. Sue herself has worked for a number of national UK campaigning organisations, including Help the Aged, Mind, Macmillan Cancer Support and Drugscope. And when we invited her to speak, and we're delighted she's here, she pointed out she'd been in the audience last year, so you never know what's going to happen to you in a year. Next up is Brendan O'Neill, the editor of Spiked, the, quote, online magazine that wants to make history as well as report it. Spiked, as people will know, is one of the long-standing online media partners for this Battle of Ideas Festival. Brendan will be widely known to many of you, whether it's for his controversial Daily Telegraph blog, his columns in The Big Issue, or the fact that he's the only journalist in the world, in fact, who's written for the Catholic Herald and the Abortion Review and been both hated and loved by both sides all at the same time. And he's the author of Can I Recycle My Granny and 39 Other Eco-Dilemmas. Last but not least is Joyce Macmillan. Joyce is Scotland's foremost theatre critic. She's one of the best regarded political commentators in Scotland. I don't think she gets enough of a voice throughout the UK. She's always perceptive and brave and says what she thinks. She's the chair of the Hansard Society Working Group in Scotland and has a long-standing involvement in Scottish and European campaigns for democracy and human rights. Thomas, give us your thoughts, please.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I think in my introductory comments, I'm going to try to be a social scientist, and then you'll get more of my opinions probably later on during the debate. Because there is a bit of sorting that needs to be done when we talk about the concept of equality. There was never any agreement, as it were, as to what equality meant. There was never even agreement over whether it was desirable or not. In 1789, it was a very radical idea, equality, égalité, the French Revolution, very radical idea. But it largely concerned equality before the law, and to some extent equal political rights, but not political rights that should benefit everybody, of course. I mean, it was largely the political rights of bourgeois men, okay, at the time. Still a very radical idea. that bourgeois men should have political rights along with the nobility, and that there should be equality before the law. So later on, I mean, this concept has taken on this life of its own. Today, it seems as if there is no disagreement as to the desirability of equality, although there is a lot of disagreement about what it means. It's a bit like justice and democracy. I mean, nobody in their right minds can be against justice. I'm all for injustice, or I don't think democracy is a terrific idea. In fact, there are people who don't think that democracy is a terrific idea nowadays, but I mean, certain climate activists and so on, but let's not talk about that. Everybody agrees that equality, or the wrong kind of inequality, is a bad thing. Now let's think a bit about what is the wrong kind of inequality. First of all, is it simply difference? There is a conflation very often with equality and similarity. In fact, in some European languages, such as Norwegian and Danish, one doesn't even distinguish between similarity and equality. It's the same word, likhet. And as a result, immigrants who want to be equal are being told that first you have to become similar, you know? You have to be like us in order to get equal rights. And if you don't want to be like us, it's just too bad, because that means that you'll never be equal. It's your own fault if you're being discriminated against in the labour market, because you didn't want to be similar. Du vil ikke være lik, as you would say in Norwegian. You didn't want to be similar / equal. So you have this problem with inequality. Also, it is quite clear that very often when we believe that what we see is inequality, what we really see is just difference. Because there is a common assumption that difference, in terms of, I mean, culture, for example, you have a minority which behaves slightly differently, has different values, a different maybe kinship system, and so on, different religion, different practices. This is being seen as a want, as a lack. They lack something that we have. And we offer them the best we have to offer, talking about the dominant majority in West European countries, namely the right to be just the way we are. And if they're not grateful, it's again, I mean, it's their own problem. So those are some of the terminological problems, as it were, with the term equality, the conflation with similarity, and the fact that there is no real agreement as to what it should mean. Should it just be formal equality? Formal equality in terms of formal equality of opportunities. That's a sort of conservative view. You have the other view, which implies that equality should entail real equality of opportunities, meaning that you have to do something about, say, differences in background, in gender, in race, ethnicity, and so on, in order to even out some of these initial differences. Or, the most radical view, should it entail equality in results? There are some theorists who are interested in the educational system who seem to imply that until we have equality of results, we cannot sort of sleep sound at night. I mean, we really need to have that in the end. And as a result, I mean, equality turns into maybe a parody of itself. But I'd like to now to perhaps make to present an opinion. Okay, I've got about 3 minutes left, I think, so I can present an opinion. I think there are certain forms of equality which are, or rather, a desire for equality, which is ingrained in the human species. That we have an instinct for justice. Okay, and that there are certain forms of inequality that we more or less instinctively react against. Now, what are those? What are those instinctive, as it were, reactions against certain forms of inequality? Not all forms of inequality. I think many people in our part of the world think it's okay if the boss has a salary which is twice as big as mine, or 4 times as big, but not 400 times. That doesn't seem fair. There is quite a bit of research on what some scholars talk of as the free rider detector module. The free rider is he or she who wants to take out part of the reward without sort of paying for it, as it were, without making an effort, without contributing accordingly. But the question is, who are the free riders in our kind of society? Are the free riders asylum seekers who take out welfare benefits without having paid taxes? Or are the free riders, well, the people in this part of London, basically, who make an extraordinary amount of money with apparently very little of what ordinary decent people think of as real work? So there's a left-right sort of take on inequality and on justice. I was in an East European country some years ago. My host, who was a professor of English, he drove me around in his tiny Fiat. And as we drove around the countryside in this country, most of the vehicles we encountered were horse carriages, basically. But there was the odd black BMW or Mercedes. And then this guy says, look, I don't care. I mean, I don't mind that some people drive BMWs, whereas I, although I work a lot, I teach students all the time, and I teach them English, which is very useful, and I still drive a small Fiat. I don't care, because I don't care about big cars. I'm interested in Joyce and Shakespeare, you know, so I don't want a big car. But think about the guy with a horse carriage. His problem is not only that he has a horse carriage, whereas the other guy has a BMW, but that he knows, the guy with the horse carriage, he knows how the guy in the BMW got the money to buy it. And he doesn't enjoy thinking about that. This is a form of injustice. And I can tell you afterwards which country it was, if you're interested. Yeah. So in other words, there are certain forms of inequality which are by and large accepted, and certain forms where we identify free riders. And I think this is fairly universal. I mean, think about it. Isn't it universal? We don't like free riders, but there is disagreement as to who they are. So that, which we react against. And this is the background of phenomena in today's world, such as the Occupy movement, for example, where there is a real sense in which our countries are becoming more unequal. Yes, there is more inequality in the world. You can see it globally, but you can also see it within each country. I mean, you can see the proportion of Americans who control 20% or 40% or 50% of the wealth in the country is shrinking. You know, fewer and fewer control more and more. This is happening in the UK as well, and it's also happening in fairly egalitarian countries such as Norway and Sweden, that the gaps are widening. Although there is no widespread perception that this is because the rich people are working so hard, that they're working so much more than everybody else. And this triggers, you see, the instinctive reaction to the free riders. So this is where I'd begin, by exploring inequality, by starting by thinking about which forms of equality are considered legitimate and which are not.
So, Trevor, your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Claire. And also, thank you for pointing out that I am now, I'm very glad to be out of public office. It means I will never again have to receive the Kazakh ambassador and explain to him why I can't lock up Sacha Baron Cohen for being horrid to Kazakh people. The answer to the question set by the session to me is very straightforward. What's wrong with equality? Actually, not very much. Other than we are all talking about different things. In our discussion, we'll probably talk a lot about numbers, the wealth gap, the income inequality gap, pay gap, still 1 to about 15%. We might talk about the education gap. This year, if you are young, black, male, you are 3 times as likely to go to prison as you are to a Russell Group university. Now, I think these are all great numbers, very interesting. They are all to some extent great combat weapons, but I don't think they necessarily help us to illuminate some of the underlying questions, and indeed to deal with the kind of inconsistencies that Thomas talked about. So, for example, we worry a lot about the vast earnings of people in the EC1 district, but I don't suppose anybody at all is going to be worrying about the fact that this afternoon there'll be about 1,000 guys who go out on a football pitch and will earn somewhere up of £100,000 for doing what? Running around, and in the case of Manchester United, not very creatively, for 90 minutes. On the other hand, if you're talking about Chelsea, it's entirely worth it. So I think we might need to think again about our starting point, and I want to make my starting point somewhere different. Isaiah Berlin once said that the real challenge for modern societies are how we live together graciously. And I want to emphasize a point here: live together graciously rather than just live together. And I think that is becoming harder and harder across lines of difference. I spend a lot of time abroad at the moment, and it's completely clear that the differences of class, ethnicity, gender mark cleavages in modern and developed societies which make it more difficult to live together graciously. And that is becoming increasingly a phenomenon in our societies as globalization means we meet more different kinds of people all the time. There's greater competition for resources, and we all have to adjust to the speed of change, technological change, and so on. I just want to make one very simple point. When we're talking about the issues of policy, we can get confused about whether we're talking about individuals or whether we're talking about categories. Actually, the challenge for public policy and law, and indeed government, are about categories. What do I mean by that? I mean that the real injustices in our societies are when we are trapped by the accident of our birth. That is to say, when our origins determine our destinies. That is what is really at issue here when we talk about equality and inequality. And the worst is when one of those characteristics, whether it's the class, the geography, our race, our gender, is what determines what happens to us. A couple of years ago, we had a case in which Pizza Hut had experienced a spate of people coming in and loading up. I know none of you you're all too posh to go to Pizza Hut, but let me tell you what happens. You can you can go in and you can load up your salad and your salad bowl with as much as you like, eat it, and pay one price and so on. What happened is people going in, loading up, and then running away. So Pizza Hut gave their local managers the discretion to make people who they had experience of or they thought were going to do this pay in advance. Well, you can imagine what happened. In some places, in one particular place on the south coast, they started charging people of one ethnic origin in advance rather than afterwards. And one afternoon, 4 black guys walk in and they sit down, they're asked to pay in advance, they say, fine, we'll pay in advance, and they're eating their meal, and then they notice that 2 guys on the next table, who happen to be white, get to pay at the end. And they say, what's this all about? And there's a row and la. Now, what is interesting about this is this. The 2 guys who paid afterwards were just ordinary people, as it were, if there's such a thing as this. They were average Joes. The 4 guys who were asked to pay in advance were professional footballers. They could probably have bought the restaurant with their loose change. But the striking thing about this is their ethnicity, what they looked like, trapped them in that particular situation. That is true. That could be true in a whole host of situations for all kinds of people. I've been in places where someone in a wheelchair they could pay for the restaurant, but they couldn't get in because there wasn't a ramp. So I think the real issue about injustice and inequality is not abstract. It is about when our category traps us in a place where we don't want to be. Economic crisis and globalization are exacerbating these issues. And I think that the central issue for us now is how we understand these questions better. And our problem is that politics hasn't helped us. The right's account of inequality is basically made nugatory by its unwillingness to accept that categories can trap you. The belief that actually, race and class and so on really are secondary to effort and so on. It's not true. And the left's problem is an overinvestment in the idea of categories as victims. It's one of the things that's really driven the left in this country and caused it, we can talk a bit more about why. The third point I want to make about what our difficulty at the moment is that we just don't know enough. We don't know enough about some of the causes and the way that inequalities work. And let me give you one very simple example. One of the most striking things that I discovered in the work that I did at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and I did some of this research myself because I'm a geek like this, is that when you look at performance at 16 plus, it is absolutely striking. In every demographic save one, there is a 20% gap between those who are affluent and those who are not affluent in terms of performance, getting through the 5 good GCSEs threshold. The one demographic in which this is not true, Chinese children. And in that particular demographic, interestingly, 90% plus of those children get through the gate. Now, the next most successful demographic, East African nations, has the 20%, as it were, class gap. Amongst Chinese, the class gap is 2%. Now, what is going on there? We don't know. And anybody who is going to trot out some nonsense about tiger moms better confront some of the East African Asian mothers who are just as fierce. We just don't know. So one of the points I want to make in this discussion is that we need to make sure that we don't substitute our prejudice and what somebody told us at Tesco's last week for actually knowing what's going on. We know a lot about discrimination, we know a lot about the environmental factors. What we do not know at the moment is enough about some of the innate clusters of capability. And I'll just say, is there a reason why over the last 70 years when the 100 metres finalists line up at the Olympics, you can guarantee that 6 out of 8 of them are men of West African descent. And this last one, 8 out of 8. Are we blinding ourselves to clusters of capability by gender, race, and so on when we talk about inequality?
Sue.
I'll give you a quick synopsis about the spirit level because some of you may not have read it. Basically, a couple of epidemiologists looked at 30 years' worth of statistical data from 23 countries and found that there was a correlation between the rates of income inequality in those 23 countries and poor outcomes in relation to health and social indicators. So the indicators that they looked at were life expectancy, maths and literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, mental illness, and social mobility. And what Wilkinson and Pickett, who are the authors of the book, go on to say is that where income inequality is not as excessive, so for example in Japan or in Sweden, the scores on all those indicators are lower. Where the gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid in a society, such as in our country or in the US, are massive, then the scores on all of those indicators are far higher. And the question has been put by those who have questioned the point implicit in that argument is there may be a correlation, but is there a causal link? Is there a causal link between income inequality and poor outcomes and all those measures? And the response has to be that, as Trevor just indicated, the complexities of how we determine the links between something like income inequality and poor rates of obesity in the UK, for example, are arguably impossible to tease out. The point is there is no equally compelling argument, there is no equally compelling explanation of those different scores in those different types of societies than the one proposed in Wilkinson and Pickett's book. And one might then conclude that it's worth investigating whether there is a causal link by redressing income inequality in a given country. So that's a quick synopsis. So in the blurb that introduces us all to this session, the question is asked whether economics is being conflated with political, and I would have to say that economics is political. All decisions about economic policy, fiscal policy, are made from a particular ideological position, be it left or right or wherever else. So I think it's misleading to suggest that there is a distinction between those two, in fact. And the blurb also asks us to, introduces this session, asks us, is demanding regulation of bankers' pay or calling for a mansion tax of the same order as the fight against apartheid or inequality? But I think this is a bit of a disingenuous parallel being drawn because, of course, regulating pay is a policy solution that may be implemented if a government was so inclined, as opposed to the structural injustices that are or were apartheid, for example. So it doesn't make any sense to compare one type of policy intervention with the structural inequality, such as apartheid. And also the question of quotas are raised, affirmative action. And the point in the blurb is made that talents are distributed unequally. And as I say in France, c'est la vie. That's just the way it is. What can you do? But some of you may be aware of the idea of the shackled runner. Funnily enough, Trevor's just speaking about running. But so the idea about the shackled runner, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that if you have two runners and they start at the start line of a 100-metre race, and one has shackles round his or her ankles. So let's personalise it. There's me racing against Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt has shackles around his ankles, and I don't. I have a history of smoking and using Ventolin. But because Usain Bolt is shackled, I can get so much further. So we run, and I am at the point where I'm just about to win. I'm 10 metres away from the finish line. And then the adjudicator of this race, who's not very quick off the mark, notices that there's an injustice. Should then the shackles be taken off Usain Bolt? Yes, they should. But then what happens? Should Usain Bolt be moved forward in the manner of an affirmative action programme, or should the race just then continue as it was? And I'd win, even with my dodgy lungs, because I'm only 10 metres away from the finish line and Usain Bolt is much behind me, even though he's far faster. So the point about talents being unequally distributed can only really be explored if one takes away the structural factors that limit access to opportunities, takes away the shackles from those who are taking part in the race of life. And then the question of freedom, and the blurb, I think I'm right in saying, sets freedom against equality. To have equality curbs the freedom of some. But to have massive inequality, as is the case in this country, which is as a direct consequence of the policies implemented by this government and the predecessor government, to have that is to curb the freedom of those who aren't born with advantage, who aren't born into privilege, and who, as things currently stand, would have to find £9,000 per year in order to get a graduate education, which, as we know, leads to the high likelihood of having higher pay throughout one's life. So there are, as a consequence of recent government policy, financial barriers erected. It's again, one has to look at the structural factors rather than pretending that they don't exist and pretending that economic and fiscal decisions are not informed by politics. I hope that we'll explore those points further.
Brendan, your take on this, please.
Historically, when people talked about equality, they meant one of two things. They either meant political equality, that is, equal rights, the expansion of freedom to more and more sections of society, or they meant material equality. That is a rethink of the way resources are created and distributed, the expansion of wealth so that more and more sections of society could enjoy it. But today, we have a really peculiar situation where the new equality industry, all these quangos, experts and politicians who pose as the guardians of equality, are actively undermining those two goals of the old struggles for equality. Today, equality is promoted not as a means of expanding freedom, but often as a way of limiting it. And equality is celebrated not as a means of expanding wealth, but as a way of shrinking wealth, or at least of making wealth less ostentatious, making it less obvious that some people have more than other people. So where once we fought for equality in order to expose greater numbers of people to the gains of freedom or the joys of wealth, now the state and its offshoots promotes equality in order to protect us from those things, in order to protect us from the alleged dangers of too much freedom and from the alleged mental distress that comes from wanting too much material stuff. So in relation to freedom, one of the most striking things about our society is how much validation and adulation the idea of equality receives and how little the ideal of freedom receives. So there are numerous quangos and think tanks devoted to promoting equality, but hardly any devoted to preserving freedom. Politicians like David Cameron are always talking about how important it is to address inequality, but they never make a loud defence of freedom. In fact, they pass laws that eat away at our freedoms. And not only does our society value equality more than freedom, it also uses equality as a tool to undermine freedom. And you can see this pretty clearly with the Equality Act, with a new duty of equality that is being enforced by the government, which some religious and political groups have raised concerns about. They're worried that it might be used to undermine freedom of conscience and freedom of association. So just consider the pretty shocking case of the efforts to force the BNP to rewrite its constitution. The Equality and Human Rights Commission argued that the BNP's constitution was anti-equality. The constitution broke race relation laws by stipulating that the BNP was only open to indigenous Caucasians. So it failed the equality test and therefore it had to go. Now, you might hate the BNP's constitution, that's fine, most normal people do, but what you should hate even more is the idea that the state should have the right to edit or trash the constitutions of political parties. Because if we accept that the state has that right, then we accept that there is no longer any freedom of association and no longer any right to political organisation. We accept that those two key freedoms, the freedom to associate with who we please and the freedom to promote whatever political ideas we like, can be undermined by the state in the name of equality. And the BNP case also showed how cynical the promotion of equality can be these days, because there were no queues of black and Asian people waiting to join the BNP. This wasn't a bottom-up demand for equality. It was a top-down exploitation of the language of equality by a state keen to punish a deviant political party and force it to conform to state values. And today's elevation of equality over freedom is really bizarre because freedom absolutely presupposes equality. Freedom is unquestionably a more important value than equality. In fact, earlier generations of people who fought for equality saw equality as important only insofar as it allowed the expansion of freedom. So for the French revolutionaries, the demand for equality was about giving meaning to freedom. It was about making freedom real by extending it, in Robespierre's words, to both slave and tyrant. Equality emerged in the 18th century as a means of realizing freedom in the real world, rather than just keeping it as kind of differential rights for certain sections of society. So today, the use of equality to undermine freedom denigrates both. It denigrates both the purpose of equality and the meaning of freedom. And then there's the debate on material equality. Here as well, there has been a serious warping of the meaning of equality. So where earlier generations fought for the creation of more, for the spread of wealth to all, today's equality quangos effectively fight for less. For them, equality means everyone having just about enough rather than everyone having a lot. And their starting point is actually the idea that desiring wealth is potentially bad for our mental health. And they've invented all these new diseases to describe this process, affluenza or stuffitis. They've kind of pathologized the desire for wealth, treated it as a kind of mental sickness, because their aim is to lower horizons. It is equality as therapy, where the aim is to make people feel better about the fact that they live on less than others. So they want to lower the perks and privileges of the rich in order to stem jealousy and desire amongst the poor. And this was best summed up by Will Hutton of the High Pay Commission, who recently said, "The knowledge that ostentatious consumption is possible has a shadow effect on every British citizen." In other words, the aim is to protect us, poor British citizens, from the sight of wealth, from the sight of all those fat cats living it up, because it might harm our mental health if we see how rich people can become. So what we have, I think the key problem today is the treatment of equality as an end in itself, the treatment of equality as the good end goal of policy making, where everyone ought to be the same. Everyone's earnings, everyone's educational outcomes, everyone's self-esteem should be the same. In the past, equality was not treated as an end in itself. It was treated as a tool, first for the expansion of freedom, and second for the expansion of wealth. It was about unleashing people's potential. Today, equality is promoted as a form of restraint, reining in certain dangerous freedoms, dampening down material desire. And that is why it's so attractive to the political elite. And I think we ought to tell them that actually we don't want to be equal, we're more interested in being free.
So, Joyce, you can finish off this part of the session, please, with your thoughts.
Great. Thank you. Well, very exciting and interesting to be here, I think. No more important discussion, really, than the one about the tension, if there is a tension between freedom and equality, and whether we can, in a way, get those two concepts working together again. I think just briefly what I would say in response to what some of the other people have said about that is that what Trevor called an overinvestment in categories as victims, that is the kind of equalities which apply to particular ethnic groups, particular disabilities, particular sexualities, whatever, in the absence of a robust politics to do with economic equality, and by that I don't mean the kind of let's take money off the bankers thing that Brent's talking about, I mean a serious commitment to having a more equal and rationally divided society. Oh dear me, the world's ill-divided, as the old Dundee song says. Certainly is ill-divided, and I think if you live in a rationally irrationally ill-divided society, then obviously all the other forms of politics become toxic, and the sort of investment in categories of people becomes deeply resented by those who are suffering from a categorical lack of material and social opportunity, but who don't belong to any of the categories which are kind of acceptable victim groups to people like David Cameron. So it seems to me that is important, that that other forms of equality politics, in the absence of a politics that addresses grotesque economic inequality, is extremely dangerous. But that does not mean that those forms of politics don't matter. Of course they do. Struggle for gay rights, disability rights, all the rest of it, extremely important. And of course the great struggles against racial inequality, which are not over, by the way, because whatever we say about the way we worship at the shrine of inequality, one of the things we need to address is why do we talk about it so much and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. That actually opportunities in our society are becoming more unequal, and many of the inequalities that are supposed to have been addressed by changes in the law and by specific inequality legislation are still in operation and quite severe, particularly at sort of street level. Anyway, I am particularly interested in the impacts of the kind of grotesque economic inequalities which have been growing in our society over the last generation, because this is something that I've seen in my lifetime. Going from a situation in which a manager in a company would be on a multiple of 4 or 5 times what his lowest paid worker was paid, to something where it can often be a multiple of 3 figures or higher. And I think that this kind of inequality, I mean, I understand the arguments in the spirit level and all the rest of it and the attempt to show statistically that it is damaging to health and sanity, but I often think that we don't have enough discussion about exactly how it is damaging to us. And 3 things that I've observed, which I'll just say very quickly in writing about politics over the last sort of generation, 20 years, is first of all, we really need to think about the extent to which these huge inequalities promote corruption. If you look at the MP's expenses scandal, that was entirely about a middling group of people who are being paid about 3 times more than the average wage in their salaries, but are being paid about 100 times less than a lot of the people that they have to deal with, who are the other power brokers in society, felt that they were justified in fiddling their expenses to get a lifestyle which brought them closer to other power groups in society, which were being paid at sort of private sector or very high public sector rates. And it seems to me that it's very difficult, and we need to think structurally about the impact of very high inequalities on the actual integrity of our democracy and our public institutions, because it seems to me to be profoundly corrosive. And some of the stuff that came out in the Leveson inquiry about the way that even very senior policemen can have their sort of lifestyles transformed by a little dab of money from someone like Rupert Murdoch is extremely corrupting and very, very worrying. So I think inequality leads to corruption, and I think you could certainly statistically show that by looking at different countries. Secondly, it leads to a kind of madness, because you have got a governing elite with a very strong influence over all the political parties because they fund them all, and that's another thing that's changed in my lifetime. Political parties used to be kind of funded by their members and by civic associations like trade unions. Now they're largely funded by wealthy donors, and all of these wealthy donors, insofar as the attempt to morally justify the amount of wealth they have got, are slightly bonkers. There is no way that they can really prove that they are 139 times more valuable to society than a staff nurse running a great big hospital ward. And so they talk nonsense, and they believe nonsense, and they go out to dinner with each other and never meet anyone who disagrees with them. And the things that they say to each other are mad. They think that they are all wealth creators, for instance. I mean, how mad is that? You know, they shift money around and get paid colossal amounts for doing it, and they think they're creating wealth, whereas someone like my late sister, who was a primary school teacher, is a drain on the economy because she's only teaching kids to read. I mean, obviously, you know, private sector is productive, public sector isn't. Something wrong with that scale of values. So there is a distortion of the public debate in favour of a belief system which is frankly very, very close to being completely irrational. And finally, it creates a society with a lot of curious value assumptions, because despite what's been said about it being wrong for people not to yearn for huge amounts of stuff, which obviously a lot of people do, frankly, if you look at the magazines which document the lives of our elite, I wouldn't have most of that stuff in a gift. And the stuff is revolting. It's unnecessary. It doesn't conduce to human happiness. And the happiest members of our elites are the ones who give most of their money away and actually do something useful, like Bill and Melinda Gates. So it seems to me that the value system on which this idea that huge economic inequality is okay is based is just frankly dubious. I mean, most people that you meet are not made happy by having colossal amounts of revolting stuff. They're made happy by the quality of their relationships and by their sense of having a useful life in a community. And so it seems to me that we have to challenge these assumptions. We have to get out of a situation in which most of the decision makers in our society belong to an elite who are greedier, who are justifying amounts of their own wealth which are not justifiable, and who only associate with people who share their very bizarre belief systems. They don't reflect how the vast majority of people in society think. They've bought up our democracy, and it's time to take it back.
Every possible conceivable argument is on the table. I am very tempted to argue with them all. Let me just start with one thing to just ask you all, which is about meritocracy, which nobody's actually used the word, but which kind of lurks. You've all referred to it, and I thought, whether it's the shackled runner or it's the question you asked about the Chinese students, Trevor, is just fascinating. I'm not saying I know the answer, but this sort of thing. Is there a danger that we're so worried about the shackles that we lose a sense of merit and treating people equally at a different level? Because, so what do you think about, for example, the proposal that university entrance, I know this is crudely put, but university entrance in this country, that in addition to looking at exam results, that you take into consideration social background, where people live, and so on and so forth. Does that distort things? And does that actually make people identified as the victim in some ways as well? I mean, trapped a little.
Thanks very much. It's an excellent way of putting it. Some years ago, I wrote a book about happiness where I drew a bit on, Wilkinson and all this sort of positive psychology from the United States and all that. And it's called the syndrome of the big bad wolf. And the assumption is that Norway is the big bad wolf after he's eaten the 3 little piggies, asking himself, what am I going to do tomorrow? In other words, it's a symptom of affluenza, as you might say. The affluenza idea is not really about mitigating the effects of inequality, but it's about the fact that we now know pretty well, after having lived in affluent society for some time, that more affluence is not what you need. When you have 3 DVD players, a 4th one is not going to make you any happier. And it's just as Joyce says. I mean, it's happiness is about a number of other things. It's about a sense of decency. It's about living in a society where you feel that inequalities are not indecently big or unjust. And secondly, to respond to Claire's question, it's also about achievement, And this is where the left has always failed. They've always given the best argument to the right, as it were, about individual achievement and merit. And in order to be happy, you have to be allowed to do something difficult and get recognition for it, in addition to living in a society where there is a reasonable distribution. So in other words, the left has a good set of arguments and the right has a good set of arguments regarding the individual in this debate.
Quick points. One is, one to you, Claire, the idea that this hasn't been contested ground, the Girondins and the Communes killed each other in thousands because they had different ideas about equality. This has always been contested ground. There's never an agreement. And, I'm sure we're going to get onto Joyce's point about, wouldn't it be fantastic if we were all kind of poor and miserable in equal doses proposition. I think we should discuss that. I don't know your background, Joyce, but all I can say is anybody who has ever been really poor, the notion that poor and happy go together doesn't really work in real life. On the issue of this university question, I don't think we should... See, this is what I mean by not knowing enough. If we think about these things in abstract, then we walk down an odd road. The question is, what is the point of the university entrance system? It is in order to help universities select people who will give us the largest number of capable graduates. That's why we spend a load of money on higher education. I know there's a lot of stuff about, it's to realise people's potential and all the rest of it, but actually the real reason the state gives a lot of money, puts a lot of money into this territory, is for a very simple reason that we need those people economically and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, what is the best way to do that? And I would argue that the problem that Alan Milburn is trying to address is that there's an existing distortion in the way that recruitment happens. That the existing education system, for reasons which we all know, actually shuts out people who are perfectly capable of becoming part of that supply of very outstanding graduates. And if I can come back to the issue of evidence and facts, as one BBC correspondent said this morning about the Andrew Mitchell thing, the facts don't matter. Actually, I think it's completely the opposite. I think the facts really matter here. In the United States, after they introduced affirmative action, this is one of the axes of the case that was made to the Supreme Court in the Michigan University case, those of you who follow these things will know about that, is that actually post-affirmative action, the great state universities, who are the biggest group of universities in the United States of higher education, of the upper tier of higher education, their quality of graduate improved post-affirmative action. It wasn't true about your Harvards and Yales and Stanford and so on, because they're a particular group. But for the biggest chunk, what affirmative action did is that it took away the blockage that would have brought, in earlier years, people into those universities who were very capable of getting very good degrees and doing rather well. So actually, affirmative action, which, by the way, I'm not particularly a fan of, but in this particular case, the evidence demonstrated that what it actually did was to improve the supply of good graduates. So I think what Alan Milburn and his study is trying to do is to point the way into which British higher education might stop depriving itself of talented and capable people, which the recruitment system currently shuts out.
I am passionate about meritocracy, but I think it's what's instructive. I mean, I live in Edinburgh, which is a university which for quite a long time has been quite fashionable with the posh. And if we think of it not so much as a problem of bright people needing a sort of illegitimate leg up to get into top universities because they come from underprivileged backgrounds, the issue in my mind is the number of posh idiots who are in courses quite clearly are only there because they've been drilled to the nth degree, because, you know, they're not particularly bright, they don't particularly know a lot about the world, they run about the place showing absolutely no sense of how to behave in society, they sort of shout their heads off, they get drunk, and yet somehow they have got into university. And it reminds me of when I was a little child in the 1950s, in that nirvana of equality, and I was reading Bertie Wooster books like this. Well, it's probably the early 60s, actually, by the time I was reading them, and I said to my mother, "But Mum, Bertie Wooster's really stupid. How did he get to go to Oxford?" And my mother said, "Well, that was in the bad old days." Well, you know, sorry, I'm afraid not. So I think if we think of it that way round, there are a lot of people in these universities at the moment who frankly are not up to it and are only there because of the sort of coaching that they've had, and they should be replaced by people who are actually, in terms of merit, more able but haven't had the same advantages.
We shouldn't be having this discussion. The cure should be in place. We shouldn't be having to stick plasters on the educational shortfall of people who have been forced into a situation where they can only have an educational shortfall at the end of being in a very poor school. Brendan, I think I'm right in saying you said at one point that all these quangos and think tanks, they want everybody to be the same. I've never heard a quango or think tank, or anybody, in fact, saying that they want everybody to be the same. My organisation, for example, wants to reduce income inequality. It doesn't want everybody to be on 15 grand. It just wants Marks and Spencer's, for example, their CEO not to be paid £8 million, whilst their lowest paid worker is getting something in the teens on national minimum wage, for example. Just to redress the disparity is what we're after. I noticed Joyce was the only one on this panel who used the word power, and that's essentially what we're all talking about. And you're right about clarity of terms, but essentially we're all talking about power. Attempts to redress inequality are attempts to distribute power more fairly. And the point about categories that Trevor mentioned, it's not categories that trap people, it's the ignorance and prejudice of people who see those categories and decide what that person is like on the basis of their being in that category.
Well, I think, you know, the obsession with wages and who gets paid what and who has what in their house and how disgusting it all is, all that stuff is really, it's basically a kind of middle-class moralism. You know, the middle classes have always been very disdainful of the very rich and quite disdainful of the very poor as well. So I think that's what's happening here. And the obsession with wages also reflects an inability to put the case for the creation of more wealth. You know, it's all about moving around those things which already exist. So this amount of money should be shifted over here a bit, and these resources should be shared out a bit more fairly over there. Whereas older arguments for equality were about expanding and growing wealth so that there was more of it for everyone. And I think the obsession with who gets paid what really speaks to the limited horizons we have today.
What do you think of what I said about corruption?
Well,
How
I think
do you avoid corruption where wealth disparities are so grotesque?
Well, you know, the idea that corruption is widespread in lots of institutions, including some of the quangos that fight for equality. You know, there is, you know, the idea that it only exists amongst policemen and...
That's a libel, by the way.
Well, the idea that it only exists
There's
between
only one.
policemen who do favours for Murdoch and everything else, that's
That's
nonsense.
a natural point I was
Yeah.
making about how
Right.
easy it
Yeah.
is to
Corruption takes many forms, and currently we live under an increasingly undemocratic political clique made up of quangos and think tanks and various other experts. Those people are as open to corruption, I believe, as are the people you're talking
Yeah.
about. I'm all in favour of removing barriers so that people have equality of opportunity, but I'm not in favour of creating leg-ups for people. That's what I think is a problem, because there is a presumption of fragility in that. There's a presumption that people are fragile, they need help, they need state assistance. That has a really dramatic impact on how people conceive of themselves and of their abilities and of their strength and their hunger and everything else. So yes, let's remove all the barriers for people going to university, getting jobs, let them compete equally, but I'm against the creation of leg-ups or state assistance to help them on their way, because I think that's patronising and destructive.
We all agree that inequality is a bad thing, and I think there's a bad way to face it, which is moralizing the problem. The question is, what is the proper way to face it? And as I see it, there is the freedom of me that I'm earning £8 million, and against the freedom of the worker who thinks that I have the right to have access to this wealth as well. And as Marx says, when equal rights collide, power decides. So I think that the best way to put forward the cause of equality is by the pursuit of power and the pursuit of personal and class interests. But how does this happen in practice? So my question to Brendan would be, if you are, let's say, to make it a caricature, like a Bangladeshi proletariat, how do you pursue the cause of equality?
Although I saw a lot of sort of eyebrows raising when Brendan was talking about how the debate about inequality tends to descend into a denigration of wealth. I think what actually happened on the panel was exactly that. And I'm sorry to you on the end, but that's what you're saying is essentially a romanticization of poverty. The ability to find happiness in really horrible situations becomes a rationale to keep people in terrible situations to which most people would not submit themselves. And when you see this in developing countries, it often becomes a rationale for people keeping people in traditional lives where it's just basically naturalizing poverty. But so yeah, the argument becomes not about sort of inequality, wanting more, wanting to create wealth, and so on. It's always like after a certain level of development, there's no more happiness. After a certain level of income acquisition, we don't see any more happiness, right? It's always very convenient that it's this level of development. You know, it's this time period. Whereas actually, I have no idea what things will happen in the future, what sorts of things I won't be able to live without, what sorts of things we accept now that we won't be able to live with. So it just becomes a very conservative argument that's wrapped up in a rhetoric of radicalism. It's basically saying, how do we hold on to the present against an uncertain future?
Why is nobody drawing any conclusion from the point that, that Trevor made about the performance of the Chinese community in Britain's schools that suggests that the thinking of the left for the past 20 years has been completely wrong? We don't know what the mechanism is precisely why those Chinese children outperform, but what it definitely must show, surely, is that the solution to the problem is within the community itself, and that designating communities as victims is actually wrong.
Equality can be achieved in two ways. Either by taking the shackle off the first person, or putting shackles on the second person. Don't you think that in some cases, in case of education or wealth, government finds out that taking shackles off from the poorer person is very difficult, so they decide, let's put the shackles on the other side? Is this the case that is working at the moment?
To Brendan, I also see the disadvantages of leg-ups, but if you don't propose leg-ups, then how do you propose to remove these barriers?
When we look back to the French Revolution stuff, we kind of tied in together reducing income inequality. Did we sort of tie that into just getting rid of grotesque poverty? And is it, now that we've slightly moved on from that, is that why we find confusion?
Casper Hewitt from The Great Debate, and I've been doing some research into this topic as well, because we're doing an event in inequality as a battle satellite, and it's actually been really depressing, the degraded discussion of equality today. Because actually equality was one of these really great political ideals. It was all about universalism. You know, it was the driver behind all sorts of things, from extension of the franchise to free education programs throughout the world. You know, and to degrade it and narrow it down to this rather miserable discussion of income inequality and austerity. You actually look at Wilkinson and Pickett's stuff, you know, their grand idea ends up being just employee share ownership schemes as the answer to all of these ills, and it just seems completely mad. And buying into some of the really degraded notions of what humanity is, you know, evolutionary psychology, and buying into the sustainability paradigm and saying that actually what we need is austerity, and celebrating the austerity in post-World War II, and saying we should have something equivalent to that, and that would be a way forwards. And I don't get it. I think we actually really need to rescue the notion of equality.
First of all, I personally think that the current tuition fee system is the fairest system we have in years and decades. Secondly, the freedom of association, as far as the freedom of association is concerned, to what extent should this freedom sort of be extended? Should pedophiles be allowed to have the right of association, for example? Then there's the point of union selection, with the affirmative selection process. I think in an ideal situation, this affirmative selection procedure should become obsolete by focusing on the secondary education system and closing the gap between public and private secondary education. The primary point I would like to raise to Brendan, the argument that innovation and entrepreneurship is only driven by the incentive of wealth is annoying the hell out of me. Because I think that innovation and entrepreneurship should be based on the drives to contribute to society as a whole, to contribute to jobs in society. And I look at society as a beehive or as an ant-hive.
But we have to deal with the reality of the political situation that we're living in. So we're suggesting things that we think, in the context within which we're operating, they might have some impact, they might be taken on board. So they may seem mealy-mouthed, they may not seem radical or dramatic, they're not meant to be. So that's the first point. Shackles on, shackles off? I don't know. I mean, arguably, reducing top pay is putting shackles on, and were that to be instituted, we could see whether that works. But I don't know.
I mean, if you're talking about narrowing and depraving public debate, the idea that people are only motivated by money, I think, is one of the ugliest aspects of the current whole political debate in Britain. And you hear people saying it all the time. Oh, you know, if these people aren't allowed these grotesque amounts of salary, they'll leave. Well, I doubt it, frankly, because people have got other priorities. They might actually like living in London, for instance, or whatever. So people's motives are very complex. Now, I'm a theatre critic, which means I deal all the time in the world of the arts, where hardly anybody earns a six-figure salary. You may be running a very big organisation and be on about 60, 70 grand if you're lucky. And nobody minds that. And I'm sorry if that's romanticising poverty. You know, 60 grand is not actually poverty in this country. That might come as news to you. But it seems to me that for people to be contented with good living salaries, doing jobs that they love, is not a bad thing. And that's what I'm talking about. I am absolutely not talking about poverty, because I grew up in a place where there was a lot of poverty. I've seen poverty. I'm not interested in poverty. But I'm interested in people living lives which are secure in the sense that they know that they have a role in society and that they have a future. And that does not necessitate anyone being paid £8 million a year. And to talk as if that was the dichotomy that we're dealing with, either grotesque inequalities or some kind of romanticisation of poverty, is to totally destroy this debate. No one is romanticising or advocating poverty. So that's not what's happening. Finally, moralism. Human beings are moral animals. As Thomas has argued, if we live in a society which appears to us morally wrong, unjustifiable, and chaotic, we start to go mad. So there's nothing wrong with moralism. Politics is about putting our moral and our ethical principles into practice. That's why we have it.
Just to add very briefly to the allegation that what one is doing when one talks about reducing inequality is romanticizing poverty and denigrating wealth. In fact, it's the opposite, because we have to look at this globally. I'm enjoying my coffee, okay? It's very cheap for me. I can drink as much coffee as I like. But the guy who picks the coffee beans, he works 10 hours a day. He'll never afford to buy a TV set. We've all read now about the ways that these things are being made in China. You know, we do have what some call a new system of slavery, only it's global and it's invisible. And these things really need to be addressed if you want to be serious about talking about inequality. And it's not about denigrating wealth. It's about distributing it in a more fair way. So when you talk about people who take a share which is not rightfully theirs, it's a result of a moral outrage, as Joyce says, and it can be turned into politics. And in fact, that is exactly what's happening around the world these days.
I just don't like the discussion about structural factors. I just don't find it convincing or useful. And what's interesting is that in their attempt to address these so-called structural factors, the state and its quangos often just create more structural factors and more structures to help people and to assist people. And it just creates layer after layer of structure in people's lives. And there's a real strong element of class determinism in this discussion, not class solidarity as you might have had in the past, but class determinism, the idea that someone's whole life is mapped out for them by virtue of the fact that they were born in a certain street or to a certain class. It's really fatalistic, the idea that your destiny is determined by where you were born and what kind of living your father did, which goes against the kind of radical outlook that people had in the past. And I think we should shake off this idea that people's whole lives are determined by their circumstances, remove the barriers, as I was suggesting.
Well, tell this to the Colombian coffee worker.
Well, no, but there's a fatalism to this, which is very, very different to the idea that people had in the past, which is that people were capable of determining their own destinies, even in extremely difficult circumstances. The equality discussion today is very patronizing and very pitying. And I think the fact that we're even talking about shackles, who should we shackle? Should it be the rich? Should it be the poor? Demonstrates how warped the idea of equality has become, because in the past the struggle for equality was about unleashing potential, removing barriers so that people could realize their potential through effort and through applying themselves. Now we have a situation where should we shackle the rich guys, should we slag off the rich, should we, all these stupid drunk rich people. The fact that we're discussing shackles is a problem. Equality is about unleashing people's potential, not shackling them.
3 points. First of all, meritocracy. Michael Young, who coined the word, actually thought it was a bad thing, because in fact what it did was give power to an oligarchy. Secondly, Brendan, can I just make a simple point, a personal point to you, Brendan? I think that your rhetoric is masking some really thoughtful argument, and I frankly just have no idea why you need to do this. I mean, everything you've said about quangos, you've not given a single actual example or named one or an actual policy. You haven't actually given a single test. On the BNP point, it's a very simple point. The BNP were breaking the law. Now, you can have an argument about whether the rule of law ought to apply or not, but if you want to have that argument, have that argument. But the basic point was they were breaking the law. My job is to apprehend people who are breaking the law. That's what we did. That's what the court supported. Now, you can have an argument about whether this assembly, by the way, for example, ought to be able to say, at this point, all the black people get out. That's what your proposition about the BNP would actually allow. And you can certainly make that case. This is there's freedom of speech for you to be able to make that case. But insofar as a law exists, it has to be enforced. And that's what we did in that particular case. What we're really dancing around, actually, is an argument about equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity and access. And in this particular situation, I'm rather, I think, on Brendan's side of this argument. I think the point about equality of outcome, for a whole series of reasons, has really rather been discredited over the last 20 years. And I think the fixation on top salaries, and I'm not disrespecting you, Joyce, but I think the fixation on top salaries is taking us away from what is the really serious set of issues about how we give people more access to opportunity, more access to power, yes, Sue, because actually the truth of the matter is, if you had perfect equality of opportunity and access, actually some people would do better. I've had a good friend called David Aronovich, who I've worked alongside for 40 years. He's a better writer than I am, he is smarter than I am, and that's why he gets paid a load of money and I don't. I accept that. That's life. That's the way it works. The only issue for me would be if people called Aronovich had an automatic pass to write for the Times, and people who called Phillips were not allowed to do that. That's not the case. So let's not moan about that issue. Let's work on the issues where those barriers still exist.
The trouble with the poverty argument is that as soon as you start comparing us to Colombian workers, we should all be happy with our lots. There's a real problem with that. You also said in your opening thing, you said that having 4 DVD players is not going to make you any happier. I'm not quite sure who voted you into power to tell me what's going to make me happier or not. I think that that's the point that was being made about the freedom of moral choices, and that you're, in a sense, trying to impinge on the ability of people to make those moral choices. Finally, the striving thing. I think it's really important that people are encouraged to strive against the shackles that they're given in society, and giving them these things, which is, that to help them out somehow, actually takes away some of their ambition, takes away some of their desire to break through the barriers that exist.
Trevor gave an example of what happened in Pizza Hut, which it seems to me illustrates the issue of formal equality. And what Pizza Hut were doing was objectionable, because the young black man has the same right to be, should expect to be treated equally as the young white man. Now, we can agree on that. And it would have been as objectionable as the admissions tutor turning down an application from a young black man because he was black. But that is not the debate which is happening in society now. The debate now, which we need to address, is to carry on with that example, the idea of the admissions tutor having an application from a young black man or from a poor man and actually giving him an advantage over others. And it seems to me that that is also a denial of formal equality. And I noticed, Trevor, that you gave an example that we can all agree with, but you haven't addressed that more difficult question, which is actually the question that we do need to address.
Hi, I just wanted to talk quickly about the Equality Act to do with art, because Brendan mentioned the Equality Act and how it kind of curbs freedom. And I do a lot of work with Equity, the actors' union, and we noticed that there were 2 men to every woman on television, and even less in theatre, and virtually no older women. And there was a big debate about whether you could use the Equalities Act within art. Is it fair? Can you tell a playwright that they have to write the same amount of women and men, which we didn't. But what we did do was use it to go to theatres and commissioning editors and point out their obligations with equality, and it has worked. We now are seeing far more older women on television. We're now seeing more women on television. So we've used it as a tool, and now in theory, hopefully, we can sit back and say, and not use it anymore, and we can go from where we are, and we've just brought everyone back to the start of the 100 metres, really.
You talked about the shackles story and how you could either bring them forward to the race or take the shackles off and then continue the race. But can you just bring it back to the beginning, take the shackles off and get someone else to observe the race to make it more fair?
We've not talked very much about gender at the moment, but I think the one thing to remember about gender, which I've learned, is that you can never stop. If you stop for 4 years, it starts to slip back again. So it's a fight that is never over in terms of getting proper representation of women in public life, because, until the day, whenever it is, when men take on an equal responsibility for private life, which they haven't yet. Who writes the Christmas cards being a big question, and who looks after Granny? Now, this question here is a very important one, the one about money, and Trevor referred to it as well, obsessing about top salaries. The point about the degree of inequality that our society has reached now is that it's not just a question of some people having a lot of personal wealth. It's a question of some people having so much, or a small cadre of people having so much of the national wealth that they are essentially buying our political system. Now, maybe nobody voted Thomas into power to suggest that nobody needs 4 DVDs, but certainly nobody voted the people into power who are creating the ethos within which our children are growing up, who believe that their whole lives are defined and their whole motivation is defined by material wealth. I think that's a reductive and narrowing view of humanity, and I think it's fed to us because it suits the interests of those who already have too much, and we do need to address that. It's not a marginal issue. It's at the core of it.
Trevor's point about throwing all the black people out of this room, well, the difference between this and the BNP is this is a public meeting, publicly advertised, to which the public has been invited. The BNP is a private association. It's a private political group. If you go right back, one of the great insights of the Enlightenment, go right back to John Locke, was the idea that private groups, religious groups, needed to have a strong element of self-governance and resistance from state intervention. And I think one of the things that the equality mission of the upper echelons of society is now doing is undermining that enlightenment ideal by throwing open private groups, private associations, freedom of association to the intervention of the state. I think that's a bad thing.
The person who said there should be no shackles in the first place at the start of the race couldn't agree more, in contrast to the person who suggested that shackles give a spur to somebody to strive against them. I disagree completely. And the point on giving people a leg up is giving them an advantage. No, it isn't. It's redressing a disadvantage.
Look, the point, Brendan, is that political parties in this society have certain legal rights. And in return for those legal rights, they have certain obligations. That's just the way it is. Now, if what you want to do is to change that balance, then change the law. But don't ascribe it to, some evil conspiracy of quangos or individuals. Deal with what's really there. And I think your argument, frankly, would be much stronger if you did that rather than trying to construct some ridiculous conspiracy. Can I just make a quick point? Most sensible comment, if I may say so, the morning, the lady from Equity, where actually what happened was transparency made the difference. You're completely right. The Equality Act doesn't take out any freedoms. You can't use it in that way. And the last point, the most significant question to me, the gentleman who asked, who said that what about, if the Pizza Hut thing works another way? You're completely right. And this is the point I started out by saying. There are a lot of things we just don't know how to solve yet. And in the meantime, what we tend to do is to try, in a situation where we think that there is a kind of cultural or institutional or structural bias, to introduce some other levers that will counterbalance that. Now, I think that's a halfway house. It's an inadequate solution, but sometimes it's the only way that we can make sure that that some biases which exist for reasons that we don't quite understand and we can't quite solve, that it's remedied at some level in today's world. It's an inadequate answer, but it is the only one we have at the moment.
So, first of all, there's something very British about the way this debate is being framed there, about equality. There's a lot of talk about money and class and a bit about liberal virtues, very much in the spirit of John Stuart Mill. Had this debate taken place in France, presumably there would be a lot of discussion about civil aspects of, civil rights and that sort of thing. Had it been in Denmark, everybody would have spoken about the Muslims and the cultural minorities and how to integrate them and how to force them to be equal, because we don't want them to be different. Had it been in Sweden, everybody would have talked about gender. In Sweden, equality is gender equality, and in Norway partly the same. So I just like to give that brief context, and then very briefly to reiterate my own position to preclude any misunderstandings. Yes, I'm against shackles, okay? I think, equality of opportunities does create differences because we are differently gifted, differently motivated, and so on. But we should try to neutralize the differences in background in order to create that equality of opportunities. But when those inequalities do emerge as a result of the equality in opportunities, there are limits as to what human beings are prepared to accept regarding inequalities. And this is really what Joyce has been harping on about, and importantly so. And it's an important point to make because it's exactly what we see happening around ourselves now in the world. That, in fact, as I said, a diminishing number of people are demanding and grabbing a larger and larger share of the pie. And the people around the world are simply not prepared to accept that anymore because it goes against our innate propensity and instinct and all our sort of emotions that tell us about, justice, fairness, and the limits of inequalities.
Perfect battle of ideas. Thank you very much to all of you.